They really had to fight. Not only did they have to fight the evil empire, but they had to fight being branded as Bolsheviks, as revolutionaries, as socialists, as communists. And really, they're just simply farmers who wanted a fair shake.
Production funding is provided by a grant from USDA Rural Development and by the members of Prairie Public.
Good morning, Bank of North Dakota.
The state of North Dakota is in the banking business. That's what the Bank of North Dakota does, and it's one of the biggest banks in the country, assets of $2 billion, and some say the biggest bank between Minneapolis and Seattle. And it's something that has served the needs of North Dakota quite well. And actually, most North Dakotans are very, very proud of it.
Our state is growing. We're getting, I think, exciting new businesses and new business opportunities. We want to grow our state's economy. We want to diversify our state's economy, and the bank's part of that and grows with it.
Here you are. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think that desire on the part of North Dakotans to want to be a part of their own destiny is really the reason that the bank exists.
The Bank of North Dakota's roots are planted in the early years of settlement and the out-of-state big businesses that manipulated the local economy.
The thing that we know about farming, it's an industry where you have very little control. You have the weather, which you've got no control over. You have the banking interests and the costs of interest itself, which you've got no control over. You've got the grain elevators and the railroads, which you've got no control over. They were still competing on an international market even then, which they had no control over. The prices that they got for the grain and the cost of their seed, they had no control over. And so the idea that they could take control over some of these questions that affected their livelihood was, it was a fabulous idea as far as those farmers were concerned.
After achieving statehood, North Dakota tried unsuccessfully to create economic independence. But year after year, efforts to organize farmer co-ops were stymied by the Twin Cities-controlled political machine in North Dakota.
The co-op movement was the first effort to try to deal with this corporate economy. When it comes to dealing with these large corporations, an individual business person or an individual farmer did not have much bargaining power. And the co-op movement is one attempt to try to deal with this by organizing many into one company. One company then would negotiate the price of inputs and also negotiate the price of their outputs. World economy was changing because of the creation of these corporations, and that North Dakota's economy too was going to change.
Both populism and progressivism failed in North Dakota. Both of those political movements tried to organize the farmers to take control of the means of production, if you will, both their financial needs as well as their grain milling and transportation needs, and they both failed.
Even as late as World War I, out-of-state grain brokers controlled the price for North Dakota wheat. Out-of-state railroads controlled the cost for North Dakota shipping. And out-of-state bankers controlled the interest rates on North Dakota farm loans and mortgages. By 1915, North Dakota was ready for revolt.
Sometimes politics are led by charismatic leaders, and you had in A.C. Townley a charismatic leader, someone who knew how to organize, someone who had been a Socialist Party organizer but had been fired by the Socialist Party in North Dakota, who decided that, this is still a good idea.
Townley's plan was simple. To break the control of out-of-state big business, North Dakota would control its own economy by creating industries that would be owned not by big businesses, but by the state.
The League's program, I would call it state capitalism, actually. It was the idea of the state intervening to actually help not just save, but help evolve the existing type of capitalism into something that was more competitive with the outside economy, which would be corporate capitalism.
Townley's Non-Partisan League swept across North Dakota like prairie fire.
They really liked the ideas that Townley presented to them about taking control of their own economic, not their future, their economic present. You know, having some control over their lives.
At hundreds of speeches and meetings, Townley and other league organizers recruited a nearly fanatical following.
That is the way it is with the money that comes from the East. There are lots of fellas passing it along, and like the water, they slop about half of it out on the way down. You fellas have been up against that for many years. You've seen the fellas passing the money down the line in the pail. They do it here in this town and in other towns in North Dakota.
It wasn't about politics, interestingly enough. It was about the policy, you know, supporting a policy that would help them really put a stake in the ground and become successful farmers.
In its first 6 months, the league recruited 26,000 members.
So you had an organizer who knew how to speak the language of farmers. You had banks that were playing into the hands of the argument. You had farmers whose crops had failed for the last couple of years, so they didn't have anything on hand. Everything aligned at one time in one place, which made it possible.
In 1916, after only a year of organizing, the League swept into power. In 1918, it engineered a political landslide.
In 1919, the Non-Partisan League took control of the House of Representatives, of the Senate, the state Supreme Court, and the governor's office.
Now the League had the power to implement its industrial program.
There were 3 bills that the legislature in 1919 passed. The one created an industrial commission, which included the governor, the attorney general, and the secretary of agriculture and labor at that time, which is what he was known, to run the bank. And that was the industrial commission. Those 3 elected officers were going to run the industries. At that time, all 3 of those officers, of course, were non-partisan leaguers. So the first bill created an industrial commission. The second bill created the industries itself, created the Bank of North Dakota, and allocated funds, startup funds we would call it today, to the bank. And then the legislation also allowed for the creation of the state-owned mill and elevator. The third bill allowed the state to sell bonds to the tune of around $12 million to fund the industries. And those 3 bills were introduced in January and were signed into law in February. You know, they had less than 2 months. They had passed those 3 bills, and Bank of North Dakota was on its way.
For farmers who were paying sky-high interest rates to Twin Cities banks, the Bank of North Dakota's farm loan program was a godsend. In its first 5 months of operation, the bank received more than $8 million worth of farm loan applications that were supposed to be funded by the sale of $10 million in state bonds, but the bonds weren't selling.
It's fascinating when you think about it. Here's the state of North Dakota who's going to create a state-owned bank which runs directly in the face of private capital, private banking, banking as we knew it in the state before. They hired W.F. Cathro, who was the first president of the North Dakota Bankers Association, to be the director general of the bank. So they create this socialist institution. They hire a banker, a well-respected banker, to run the bank. He then goes to the banks in the state and says, I have $10 million worth of bonds to sell you. And as soon as you buy these bonds, I can then make loans to farmers, charging 2% less interest than you're charging. So come and buy these bonds from me. And it's like the state bankers are saying, you got to be kidding me. The Minneapolis bankers are saying, you want us to buy the bonds so you can cut our lending to North Dakota farmers? I don't think so.
By 1920, the Bank of North Dakota was on shaky ground. Because the bonds were not selling, the bank was forced to freeze all further farm loans. Even worse, the bank was experiencing serious cash flow problems.
We haven't had a liquidity crisis in the state's economy like the one we had in the 1920s. And it's probable that the crisis in the 20s was even worse than the one in the 30s, judging on the number of banks that went under.
The economic crisis gave League opponents the opening they needed. The Independent Voters Association was well funded by out-of-state interests and determined to keep the bank from selling the bonds it needed to finance the farm loan program.
The sale of the bonds is in some way the most interesting and fascinating aspect of this whole business, because if those real estate bonds sold, it meant the bank would be in business. And so the Independent Voters Association, the North Dakota Bankers Association, anybody who was opposed to the idea of a state-owned bank worked to stop the sale of those bonds. And there is a 30-month period in North Dakota history. I don't think we've ever seen the intensity, the political infighting, the struggles between people who wanted to sell the bonds and Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, these national magazines involved in the arguments around whether North Dakota can sell those bonds.
That helped the opposition not only coalesce, but to attract additional members.
Well, it was very interesting to me that both Great Northern and the Northern Pacific pretty much gave lawyers to the opposition. The court challenges, both at the district, the state, and the Supreme Court level, challenging the sale of the bonds and the right of North Dakota to create a state-owned bank. The whole argument about who's going to audit and who's going to make sure that the books aren't crooked. If you think we have intimidation today, this is nothing compared to what was going on in 1919 and 1920.
People in this state are generally pretty skeptical about government anyhow. And here they were kind of going out on a limb, putting faith in these political leaders that they would bring about a political revolution that would help their local economy. But the minute that that political revolution looked like it might be tainted with corruption or tainted with special favoritism for certain individuals in the state, that just fed back into the natural cynicism that seems to be characteristic of an independent farmer. So the minute that the League was tainted, whether they were acting politically or were acting economically, I guess doesn't matter now, because the public decided that they were acting politically.
In 1921, with the bank rocked by allegations of favoritism and mismanagement, North Dakota became the first state in the nation to recall an elected official from office. And it recalled not just one, but the entire Industrial Commission. Voters removed the NPL governor, attorney general, and agriculture commissioner from office and replaced them with IVA-endorsed candidates. The Bank of North Dakota was now in the hands of its greatest opponent.
The bonds were sold the day before the opposition took control of the bank. And so finally, the opposition, the IVA, which was opposed to state ownership, which was opposed to the Bank of North Dakota, all of a sudden had $12.3 million. And I think that's really the irony of the Bank of North Dakota. The bank only became successful once the opponents of the bank took control of it. And in some ways, the Bank of North Dakota is an example of pragmatic politics over political philosophy. I mean, the amazing thing is that the IVA didn't shut down the bank. And it shouldn't be amazing because, hey, I have a bank at my disposal. I'm going to shut this down? I don't think so.
Although the bank now had funds for its loan programs, the IVA was caught in a trap. Voters expected the bank to make farm loans, but the farm economy was collapsing.
It couldn't have come at a worse time. The agricultural depression in the state, nobody would be lending money. I suspect the Minneapolis banks were laughing their head off about this time because all of a sudden they were off the hook from having to lend. In some ways, I think probably the NPLers were glad not to be in control of the bank at that time, because the idea of creating an institution, lending monies to the farmers, and then being a bank that had to foreclose on those same farmers to protect the investment, I think it would just have wrenched their heart out.
I got $100 bid. Thank you, sir. 10, 20. I got 10 now, 20 now, 20 now, 10 now, 20 now, 20. Yes, $20 now, $30 now, $30 now, 30.
During the Depression, what the per capita income of North Dakota was $142. Per capita income, $142. That's 40% of the national average. There's great poverty in this state. And so here's the bank holding thousands of loans of people who couldn't pay, who might still be living on the farm, still be living on the land, but can't pay the mortgage.
Dear Sir, I am enclosing for your inspection just my predicament at present. Is there anything you can do to prevent this foreclosure of our home? We are at our wits' end to know what to do. And as Mr. Mueller has owned and farmed this quarter of land for over 40 years, it would be almost his death now to be turned away with nothing.
I would go into the research at the State Historical Society, and I would come out in tears because I was reading through all of these farm loan files. I mean, there'd be scraps of paper. And think about a time when paper and pencils were so rare. I could imagine these people writing with a stub of a pencil. I don't know why you keep sending me letters asking for money. I don't have any. I told you that.
As the Depression worsened, the IVA-controlled bank found itself in the position of having to foreclose on farm after farm.
At one point, it owned something like 6,000 farms, but it had to own them to protect the mortgages. To protect the real estate bonds, it had to own the farms.
In 1932, NPL maverick William Langer was elected governor on the strength of his campaign promises to protect farmer interests.
This is where Langer came in with his foreclosure moratorium, illegal or not, didn't matter, where he just said, okay, enough. We are not going to foreclose as long as the farmers are living on their land. We're not going to foreclose.
He then was seen as the common sense individual that was going to rein government back in, would take the institutions that had been created, would make them operate in a much more responsible manner. I think that Langer was not necessarily acting in a league way. He was acting in an FDR way, if you'd like. The magnitude of the crisis is such that this calls for measures that we would not normally use. And it, at the same time, gave people some time here in the state to get their financial house in order. Because after 1936, if they could make it through that drought year, farm prices then came up pretty nicely as we went into World War II. And then World War II is extremely prosperous.
The 2-decade-long financial crisis was finally over, but by then, the bank's rural credit programs had long since shut down.
The original bank didn't have a chance to really get involved in those programs because the events of the 20s resulted in a wet blanket being thrown over the Bank of North Dakota. And that wet blanket, I suspect, was there probably until the 1960s, before they started to gradually pull that blanket off and, in a sense, allow the bank to be reborn again. Its primary function has always been a depository institution for political entities, counties, the state, state-owned institutions. That is still the main source of its deposit base. So that role has not changed over the history of the bank, but over on the lending side, that is especially what has changed.
50 million. First one on the first page is to continue to be the primary facilitator for loan participations with North Dakota banks.
Since the 1960s, the student loan program and then the commercial lending programs and the agricultural lending programs and even the entrepreneur and new business, that's more of a venture capital function. Now all of that has been allowed under the original legislation that was passed back in 1919. So it seems that no one's had to go back and invent this institution. All of its powers were created then after a period of penance, of course, for the sins of the 1920s, And it probably has paid for those sins, I would say. It's now rediscovering its original potential.
The Bank of North Dakota has grown and changed many times, but it has not strayed from the original plan laid down by the Non-Partisan League.
You know, they behave like a bank, but with an economic development mission, you know, which is kind of the neat thing about the Bank of North Dakota. That's still part of that whole NPL rut that was put down in 1919. And I think way back then, I think it was really the intent of legislators who created the Bank of North Dakota to create a bank that would help agriculture and commerce and industry and help the development of those sectors of our economy. There may have been a time when the bank drifted from that, but I think it's there today.
My view of what the bank should be doing, I came to the bank with in 1993. I would encapsulate it in saying the Development Bank of North Dakota. My view of banks is that they are to lend money to people, whether it's to start a business, to buy or expand their farm or ranch, to buy a home, to get a school, and whatever it is, that a bank is successful if it does a good job of lending in its community. That helps the community grow and prosper. That's what makes the bank grow and prosper. So that, I mean, that's my philosophy of banking, I guess. When I came to the Bank of North Dakota, the total loan portfolio in 1993 was $200 million. When I left there 7 years later, it was $1.2 billion. That's $1 billion over that time frame that we invested in North Dakota farms and businesses and homes and students and all those kind of things. Ultimately, and its reason for being, is to serve the citizens as the development bank. Help invest money in North Dakota so that they can grow businesses and farms and build homes and get an education.
Some of the things that we're able to do at the Bank of North Dakota are just incredible. New industries that we've helped develop. You know, we're at the forefront of every major economic initiative, whether it's building airplanes in Grand Forks with Cirrus, or ethanol plants, or helping the farm economy. It's responding to our needs across the state and the ability to have an impact and to have a positive impact on the state and to really help fulfill the mission of the administration as they work forward and looking at the vision for the state of North Dakota and working with the legislature to fulfill their vision for where the state should be going. So it's being an impact player in the state of North Dakota. I mean, that's going to be our course for as long as I can see.
It's very interesting that despite the fact that there have been some attempts over the years to sell the Bank of North Dakota or to abolish it, that the bank has really worked to serve its own niche in the North Dakota economy.
You know, I always tell our staff that when you are an organization of one, it's pretty easy to become extinct. Our mission has been consistent, that we are here to encourage and promote agriculture, commerce, and industry. So, you know, I don't think we can ever get too far away from that. What we can do is be more diligent in how we deliver those services and to make sure that we are always market-driven and that we're able to react to it.
An important part of economic development is as our people come forward with creative ideas and try to do things, in almost every case, financing is part of the equation. That creates more jobs and more opportunities. That's what the Bank of North Dakota does, and it needs to continue to be an important part of our growth and development.
Well, I think that's...
The fact that it has matured into the kind of bank that it is really shows why it does serve a purpose, even though it is, some argue, a socialist institution. Now that might seem unusual, and it is, but it really does underline how hard the bank works to be a part of the state of North Dakota, of the economic development that we see for the state of North Dakota, and it is a part of the infrastructure, is a part of the history and tradition of North Dakota, and is really a full partner in the state of North Dakota.
It's an amazing part of history. It really is an amazing part of history. I think the industrial program and the effort by the Non-Partisan League really was wake-up call, both for the state saying they could have some control over their economic destiny, as well as wake-up call for the interests, if you will, the grain and railroad and banking interests that they couldn't take for granted, the people of North Dakota or the industry of North Dakota. I mean, we've got a lot to be proud of in this state, and we should be. And the bank is just one of those institutions that we can be proud of, both for creating it as well as managing it, as well as we have. You know, it's pretty phenomenal.
I think the people of North Dakota still believe a lot in themselves. And the Bank of North Dakota is kind of a manifestation of that. It is, by golly, you know, we think we ought to control our own destiny, and one of the ways we can do that is to own our own bank. We're kind of an independent lot in this state. I think there's still quite a bit of that old nonpartisan spirit in North Dakota. You know, I think in the end, that's why the bank is still here.
To order a DVD of this program, call 1-800-359-6900 or visit our website at www.prairiepublic.org. Production funding is provided by a grant from USDA Rural Development and by the members of Prairie Public.